Tonight on Nation to Nation, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump continues to make threats against Canada. Veteran American journalist Mark Trahant is here to tell us what Native Americans are saying.
Is what does it mean for the border? And to be able to cross the border for things like powwows and ceremony and things that are fairly routine.
Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay says Canada has entered a state of democratic dysfunction.
The recent prorogation of government is just at an appalling time. There's never been such a matrix of crisis facing this country.
Wayne Garnons-Williams says the Trump tariff threats against Canada may provide new opportunities for intertribal trade.
Canada's inclusive trade agenda includes Indigenous people, includes having women involved in women businesses, in having people that are physically challenged.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Donald Trump is still 4 days away from being inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States, but this has not stopped him from making comments on any number of issues, including imposing tariffs on Canadian goods, making Canada the 51st state, and annexing Greenland. Joining me today to talk about it all is independent journalist Mark Trahant, who has been covering Native American politics for more than 5 decades. He joins me from Phoenix, Arizona. So welcome back to Nation to Nation, Mark.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
So as you may know, probably because you follow the media, obviously, that Donald Trump, of course, is saying a lot about Canada, and Canadians are talking a lot about him. But I'm interested what Americans are actually saying, and Native Americans, about sort of all the threats that the president-elect is making about Canada. Is it registering at all?
Absolutely. And you look at some of the threats, not just Canada, but Greenland, and they're involving Indigenous people. I think one of the major concerns that's popping up immediately is what does it mean for the border, and to be able to cross the border for things like powwows and ceremony and things that are fairly routine. Is that going to get a lot more complicated? What about immigration penalties for Canadians in the United States? Will there be a part of that big wave of expulsions? Those are kind of some real questions. You know, it's interesting, with 4 days left right now, I think a lot of Indian country is still looking at the last 4 days to see if the President Biden, before he leaves office, will grant clemency to Leonard Peltier, which also has a Canadian angle. And I know that a lot of people are looking at the last 4 days as this probably his last chance for any kind of executive clemency.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's just move back to that for a second. I know that Biden has made a number of, clemency to a number of people. Do you think there's a serious chance that he might do it with Peltier?
I do. I think there are a couple of issues. One, it's clear now, based on the evidence, that his trial wasn't fair, and whether or not he's innocent or not is completely separate from whether he got a fair trial. And the second thing is, even if you think he's guilty, he's been in prison longer than any other federal prisoner for that sort of charge. And that I think the issue of fairness then crops up. And I think the third issue is it in the United States' interest to have him die in prison? And clearly it's not. For a lot of reasons, I think this might be the opportunity to move on that.
So let's just move back to the border issue for a second as well. Of course, that's always been an issue here for First Nations people, free movement on unceded lands, right? And I assume it's been sort of the same issue in the United States. Have people been taking it to the next level, like for Native American leaders, of saying that this is something really that they don't want to accede to, that they would like more free movement allowed of people between the territories, which often overlap in the United States and Canada?
Absolutely. And it's, in addition to people, you have the issues of regalia. If the border is going to be being watchful for eagle feathers and other things like that, it's a problem. And I mean, we're supposed to have the Jay Treaty, which has its own issues. But the Jay Treaty promises that free movement, and it's something that people in tribal communities view as a very important principle.
Now, moving back to the tariffs just for a minute, I mean, of course, anyone that studies this knows that if the president-elect was to go ahead or try to do this, it would cause a lot of economic harm both to the United States and to Canada. So that it's obviously dominating the airwaves here. Do you think that this is something he seriously plans to go ahead with? Could he get it through Congress, or would he just face so much kickback that?
Well, that remains to be seen. It's fascinating that so many of the, particularly the farmers that voted for him, would be the first to suffer from tariffs. And the second thing they would suffer from is if there's an immigration crackdown, they'll lose a lot of the folks that help them harvest their crops. So those are two big issues right there that his promises, I think everyone voted for him hoping that it wouldn't come to pass, that he just bluster. But I think there's a good chance that some of this will happen. With tariffs, the president has enormous power. That's one of the areas where he has the power to act without Congress. And it could actually be really disruptive in that sense. And you look at how important Canada is a trading partner, not just, it's not just a one-way thing. I mean, you look at outside of Detroit and a lot of the cars, it's hard to tell which part of it would be Canadian and which part of it would be made in the United States.
Now, let's say as far as the states are concerned, because a lot of course, we have these border communities, and a lot of states are very, I mean, there's lots of trade going on. If he was to go ahead, would there be any options for the states to fight this?
At the state level, probably not. What the states could do, though, is offer a credit of some kind to try to make up for it. Because the irony of tariffs is that consumers pay them. If there's a 10% tariff levied, it just means the price of that product goes up 10%. So maybe states could do something in that regard.
Okay, now I'd like to move to the comments about that the president-elect has made about Greenland annexing it, buying it. Now, of course, we know that Greenland is a largely indigenous country that has been historically under the control of Denmark. Are Native Americans talking about this issue as well? And what do you think could be some of the larger implications on a global scale?
Well, in one way, their larger scale might be a renewed interest in an Inuit homeland. And whether that's in the United States or Canada or Greenland, folks are talking about that in a different way. And I've just watched a couple of videos from Greenland this morning, and all of them were saying, this is not Denmark's decision. Greenland is for Greenlanders. And the idea of an Inuit conversation across borders, I think, has really become more important. This may be the push to make Greenland totally independent from Denmark. And it may be that Denmark is going to lose the edge on this because Greenlanders will just say it's time. And already Greenland is independent except for a couple of areas involving foreign affairs and national security. So it wouldn't be that much more for them to take to the next level. I think one of the questions that Greenlanders are also asking is what the role of the United States military would be, and would there be some accommodation absent sovereignty that would allow them to work together with the United States.
So obviously no shortage of interesting discussions. I'm sure they'll carry on, but we'll unfortunately have to end it there. But as always, thanks for joining us.
Happy to do it.
Next up, we'll talk to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay about democratic dysfunction and how this is affecting Canadian parliamentary politics. Welcome back. You could say Parliament is in a state of democratic dysfunction these days. The House of Commons was virtually paralyzed during the recent fall sitting, over opposition parties' continued demands and the government's continued refusal to release documents related to a green technology development fund. Then just last week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced he will resign once a new Liberal leader is in place, and prorogued Parliament until the end of March at the same time. Joining me today to talk about it all is Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay. So welcome back to Nation, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
Okay, so in your latest column, you sort of address this democratic dysfunction. Can you tell our viewers what you think is causing it and what some of the solutions may be?
Well, I think there's a number of factors that may be contributing to it. The one being that distrust of institutions that seems to be growing here in Canada. It's not just a Canadian issue. Voters and citizens of many different countries are starting to question, what do governments do? The answer to resolve that is mostly communication. I'm not entirely sure that any party in the Canadian federal government has been doing that very well. But the recent prorogation of government is just at an appalling time. There's never been such a matrix of crisis facing this country. And if we needed a prime minister that was not what we refer to as lame duck, meaning that he's already decided he will leave and therefore he's lost a lot of influence, this is when we needed a strong leader. And instead, we have a Liberal Party in disarray trying to run a leadership race. We have a threat of tariffs just days away, on top of all sorts of national issues that we know are crises: healthcare, housing, housing challenge, opioid use, and substance use. This is just a time when every direction you look, it seems there might be a crisis.
And what do you think might sort of maybe alleviate some of those issues?
Well, what is interesting to see in the last few days is the provincial and territorial premiers stepping up. I think it's a good thing to see the levels of leadership that exist across the country using their voice, speaking out for Canadians. Some might say that they're stepping into a void in which a prime minister has created, but you know what? We need strong voices for Canada to get into these serious discussions. What should we do about tariffs? What are our options? How do we come together to face this threat from to the south?
Now you talk about sort of the problem with the tremendous power that the Prime Minister's office wields. Often there's been complaints that they hold more power than ministers and even rival the power of the Prime Minister. What do you see if there is a change in government? Do you see this trend changing, or keeping on the same trend, or maybe even increasing?
Canada is quite unique in its federal parliament in terms of the number of political advisors. They're not elected. We don't know who they are. They're not accountable. But you rarely see a minister nowadays from the Liberal government for the past number of years speaking without an advisor nearby. The strength of the Prime Minister's office, which is all political staffers, they're not civil servants for the most part. Any of them? I don't think any of them are. It's huge. Canada has the largest number of political advisors of any country with a Westminster government. Will it change with a new government if the Conservatives got in, or the NDP? I doubt it. But it is actually a serious issue. It's starting to fray at the accountability of government. It seems like political advisors have more power than the people we actually elected.
Okay. And I'd like to just turn now briefly to the Liberal leadership race. Of course, that's on now that the Prime Minister has said he will resign once a new Liberal leader is in place. What would you like to see there?
It is too bad that this Liberal leadership race is going to occur so quickly. It would have been helpful if there was some time to get into some serious questions. What should the future of this country look like? And specifically, how does reconciliation fit into a Liberal leadership race? Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see much substance. It's so short. It also has quite a high entrance fee. One would need to put up $350,000 just to start one would have to put up $350,000 simply to enter the race. It is pretty high. That's a steep fee that will certainly keep out those who are not serious. But I wonder who else it might keep out, who might actually be a voice we needed to hear.
Now, one of the candidates or proposed candidates that says he plans to enter, but still got till next week, I guess, to decide that is Jaime Batiste, and he's First Nations. Other than that, what do you think First Nations Indigenous issues may play in this leadership contest?
I hope that these perspectives and contributions of First Nations, of Inuit, of Métis, play a role in this leadership race. My worry is that there are so many crises facing this country that we may not get the hearing that we need. What role will reconciliation and what space will it take in this Liberal leadership race? It's hard to tell. We would have looked for, in other leadership races, the Liberal Party apparatus to set something up that had more structure around it. And that really didn't happen this time. It's really hard to tell.
Okay. And in recent elections, we've seen more Indigenous people engaged at the federal level. The Liberals actually, that was part of their sort of platform, is to reach out to Indigenous people, of course. But with all this distrust around, I guess, and cynicism post-COVID, what do you think Indigenous people will do in the next election? Will they be as engaged as they have in the last few?
I would like to think that Indigenous peoples will continue to be engaged. We are, for the most part, very close to politics. With most of our family members, we would know who runs in politics in our own communities. We might have more understanding of how it plays out. And I think we actually have a lot to offer on a federal and even a provincial territorial stage. This is not a time for us to lose our voice or to not vote. We can't cede that right to anybody else at this point. We need to get out there and vote. I think we actually will continue to increase in terms of how many of us vote in any upcoming election.
Interesting. Well, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. But as always, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll talk to Wayne Garnons-Williams about the Trump tariff threats and the opportunities this may present for intertribal trade. Welcome back. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump continues to threaten he'll impose tariffs on Canadian goods. It's generated a lot of discussion in the country about what is the best response. Retaliatory tariffs is one option, but others see it as a possible opportunity to strengthen interprovincial and intertribal trade. Wayne Garnons-Williams is a lawyer and the CEO of the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation. He's also an expert in intertribal trade, and he joins me today in studio. So welcome back to Nation, but it's been a while, I guess.
Good to be here again. Thank you.
All right, so I guess first off I'd ask, can you tell our viewers a little bit about what you do in intertribal trade and your experience in it? And
Sure. Happy to. I'm chair of IDEO, the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization. We're a 501c3 educational charity organized out of Oklahoma. We've been in existence for around 10 years now, and what we do is we educate nation-states, provincial governments and tribal nations about the economic opportunities for intertribal trade and what the barriers are there and how we can alleviate those.
Okay, and of course trade is all on dominating the headlines with the threatened President-elect Trump's tariffs, tariff threats against Canada. And of course the First Ministers met here yesterday about that, the Premier and the Prime Minister. What were your thoughts on that discussion that they had from a sort of a Canadian point of view?
It's a good start because, of course, as we know, Trump has threatened 25% tariffs when he comes into office on the 20th of this month. And the danger here is the fact that he's probably going to make good on that as, at minimum, leverage, because it's his intention to reopen the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And so this is, I would say, in a best case scenario for us, an opening salvo by the Trump administration to brandish their saber and say, we're going to impose tariffs until you capitulate to what we want. So some of the things they want, of course, is tougher border security, various things that are conservative policies, which are, I think, quite acceptable for the most part for what we do in Canada. So having that aspect of coming out with the Team Canada meeting of the premiers and the Prime Minister is a good start to look at what resources we have to assemble and how we can come up with a unified voice to speak with one voice, as opposed to, for example, a premier popping off on a particular direction which causes disharmony in future opportunities for trade negotiation.
Now, of course, we were covering this yesterday, and of course, originally there was two press conferences. There was going to be one with the Prime Minister, then one with the premiers. That changed at the last minute, and they unified. But of course, there was one key premier that wasn't there, and that was Daniel Smith from Alberta. Of course, the key thing here is energy and oil. Is that something you think Trump himself might try to exploit?
Absolutely. Any sign of weakness is an opportunity to exploit it. And of course, it's not going to be Trump himself. It'll be his senior representatives, like the last time around the USMCA negotiations. Robert Lighthizer of the United States, USTR, was the lead negotiator. He's been vaulted to other positions, but one of his minions is being put in his place. So the negotiations coming up with the USMCA will be along the same lines. And of course, back then, 2014, we had Canada's Indigenous trade agenda, which was trying to put an Indigenous trade chapter into USMCA. Didn't succeed all the way, got very close to getting it, but it was killed by the Trump administration at the most senior of levels. Even though we had buy-in by the nation-state Indigenous governments, the trade negotiators from Canada, Mexico, and the United States, we're going all the way up the food chain until it reached the political level. Now, is it worth negotiating an Indigenous trade chapter with a new round of USMCA under a Trump administration? The amount of hours that the government of Canada and our committee, our Indigenous Trade Committee, put in developing our policies was useful. But now that we have those policies, will they stand the test against a Trump administration when we try and play a card to say, you know, in the new round of USMCA negotiations, we'd like to have an Indigenous trade chapter. We negotiated it last time, we'd like to have it in this time. Under a Trump administration, under their policies, I don't know. Will it stand the test? The best we can do is play our hand, see how it goes.
Now, of course, you talk about Trump's, obviously he's been president once already, and you know where he's coming from. But what about the Canadian negotiators are also one agreement more experienced? Do you think you would be able to get that into their agenda as a potential, thing that they want to talk about?
I hope so. I really hope so. It's a fascinating time because we have an inclusive trade agenda. Canada's inclusive trade agenda includes Indigenous people, includes having women involved in women businesses, in having people that are physically challenged, and representing those people within the trade sphere. So if we have a change in government to a conservative government, will this conservative government still value an inclusive trade agenda? Got to turn the page and find out. Can't say.
So we have sort of two issues, I guess, in a sense, right? We have trade between First Nations in Canada, and of course there's intertribal trade between Native Americans in the States. Where are the two countries at on that issue? Are they ahead of us? Are we ahead of them, or where's that?
Well,
at?
It's really cool because when you look at this, when you just play with this for a second with me, let's assume Trump's made the most dramatic statement of all, of course, of teasing Prime Minister Trudeau and teasing the government of Canada, saying, I'd like to make Canada the 51st state. Well, that's great, but theoretically, maybe we could look at this, because practically, probably not going to happen. But look at it from a theoretical standpoint for Indigenous rights. Just flip the page for this, for Indigenous rights and trade. If we became the 51st state as Canada, what would happen with Indigenous rights? We would be consumed by the United States judicial system. And what does that mean? Well, that's really great for Indigenous peoples, quite frankly, because back in as early as 1832, the United States Supreme Court recognized sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. So we would be, First Nations would assume that sovereignty. We would be one of the three sovereign entities in the United States: state, federal, and tribal. That's really cool. And unfortunately, though, in Canada, what we have to deal with is something entirely different, because we've got a constitution that clearly puts Indigenous peoples within the section powers of provincial and federal, 91 and 92. 91 is federal, 9124 is Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So it's clear that we are a subset of a federal power.
Right, so there's no shortage of things to talk about, of course, and unfortunately more than we can talk about on the show. But thanks very much for joining us today on a really key issue and something that's interesting, and I'm sure our viewers have a lot of interest in as well.
My pleasure. Take care.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.